Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's fireside chat on turning off the tap on plastic and petrochemicals. My name is Taylor Black. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Communications and Development Associate at CIEL, based in Washington, D.C. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to CIEL's third fireside chat in our series. For those of you who have not joined us before, the purpose of the next 50 minutes is to give you all the opportunity to ask about our work and to engage with our experts who are doing truly remarkable things to tackle the plastic crisis. If you need to leave early, we are recording this session. Kat is dropping my email in the chat, so feel free to email me if you'd like access to that link, and it will be available for 1 month. For a bit of housekeeping, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to our panelists throughout the conversation. The chat will also be used to echo instructions, share links to resources, and provide other information that is mentioned during the webinar. You should see a few messages from Kat and others there now. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then kick it over to our moderator, who will provide a little bit of background on what we're discussing today, and then we can get started answering y'all's questions. So today we are joined by some very distinguished guests who are working to tackle the plastic crisis from the local to the global level. Jane Patton is a senior campaigner with CIEL based in New Orleans, Louisiana. She is our global policy and movement building expert. She's focused on building momentum for a global treaty to tackle the full life cycle of plastic, from its origins in fossil fuel to its disposal. She's also working to align and orient different movements to stop plastic expansion at the source. Stephen Feit is a senior attorney with CIEL based in Washington, D.C. He is our corporate accountability and financial risk expert. He's working to hold industries accountable for both the plastic and climate crises. And he's also working to expose the legal and financial risks of plastic production buildout. Yvette Arellano serves on CIEL's Board of Trustees and is based in Houston, Texas. They are our environmental justice and grassroots advocacy expert. They're the founder and director of the grassroots organization Fenceline Watch, where they are building a movement of people on the fence lines of the plastic and fossil fuel industries. And they're working to hold those industries accountable for the harm they cause and perpetuate in surrounding communities. They have testified before Congress about their own experiences on the front lines of industry, as well as its impact on frontline communities. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our panelists. And I'm going to kick it over to our moderator and CIEL's Vice President, Amanda Kistler.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Taylor. It's a real joy to be here with you today. To start us off, I wanted to give us just a quick refresher on some of the work that CIEL has done historically in this space, in particular, starting with a research series authored by Stephen Feit, primarily, that was in 2016, in which we really blew the lid off the fact that plastics are derived from fossil fuels. And so this allowed us to begin campaigning in a way that really attacked the full life cycle of plastic. So, bridging movements across that life cycle from extraction of fossil fuel sources to their manufacture into plastic resins and pellets, the consumer use aspects of it, as well as disposal and waste. And what this did was start to bridge movements and bring in new allies. CIEL is a member of the Break Free from Plastics movement, which you will hear more about, I'm sure, from our panelists. And then the other major moment in CIEL's contribution to this space was around 2 reports that we put out in 2019 on the hidden costs of a plastic planet. And those were namely that plastic is a human health crisis. When you look at the toxic impacts at every stage of the life cycle, there are impacts to communities, to wildlife, to ecosystems that are real and grave. And in parallel, we had a report on the climate impacts of each stage of the plastic life cycle and revealed that the plastic crisis is also the climate crisis in another form. And so that is CIEL's contribution. We're building movements. We are bringing in new partners, and we are really connecting the local to the global in exciting ways, and enabling communities to be better resourced, and have stronger arguments to advocate on their own behalf. I'm going to kick it over to Jane Patton, who you have heard about from Taylor, to tell us a little bit about what motivated you to get involved and how are you seeing this play out in some of the aspects of your work.
I've been involved now in the plastic space generally for about a decade, so I have to reach back to remember how I got here. I first learned about plastics as a waste issue. I learned about it as accumulation in the marine environment, accumulation in the land environment. Some of y'all have probably seen the photos of the albatross chicks on the islands that had plastics in their bellies. And that was actually one of the first visceral visuals that I saw of plastics as a problem. Right around the same time that I also started learning about the greenhouse gas emissions and the toxic emissions from factory farms, and really thinking about how the ways that I was eating and the ways that I was purchasing and the ways that I was living and how that was affecting the global community. My background is in politics, but not environmental politics. So I had to learn a whole new set of understandings and skills and reflections on the system. And as I learned more about plastics as a waste issue, and as I got madder at companies like Nestle and Coca-Cola for packaging everything in plastics and trying to figure out how we could hold them accountable, it was mentioned by Taylor that I'm from Louisiana, that I live in Louisiana, and I don't just live here, I'm from here. I'm 5th generation Louisiana, which means my family has been in this state through the entire development of the petrochemical industry. And we have always lived not directly in its shadow, but in its in the path of its effects and its emissions. And, sometimes we've benefited. I have family members who work for Shell and BASF, which is a chemical company, and Exxon. But understanding my roots in Louisiana and our deep, often disruptive and some would say corrupt relationship with oil and gas industries in Louisiana, and connecting that with the plastics industries and the fact that they make plastics in Louisiana, and how carbon intensive and how health intensive, understanding that I lost people that I loved when I was young because of their proximity to the plants and the way that those petrochemical plants affect communities and are a system of environmental racism in Louisiana, and understanding how the plastics issue is not just one of accumulation in the marine environment. It's not just one of accumulation in the streets. It's not just one of litter. It's one that is affecting communities everywhere, systems wide. And so the work that I got involved in was actually trying to figure out where's the push point on that system. How do we go at its root core? And one of my early, one of the things that I was looking at initially on that was the global treaty. Amanda mentioned that CIEL is doing work on bringing NGOs and other stakeholders into the conversation about a new global treaty on plastics. And that is so exciting to me. And that was actually how I met CIEL. And that was how I got interested in the work that the organization was doing, and then eventually ended up on staff, was to see how we could mobilize international law to address this problem. And then it was so exciting for me because I get to do it from Louisiana. And I get to be here near my family and in my home place and in a place that I love with all of my heart. And I get to both organize the, folks in, I was joking earlier, in 25 time zones who speak 15 different languages, but I also get to organize my neighbors, and I get to sit and be a resource and be a support for folks here in Louisiana who are doing things like fighting the petrochemical build out, stopping the Formosa plastics plant. And so really bringing those two things together and getting to work across the Gulf with partners like Yvette, who I've known since before either of us was at CIEL. So so that's exciting.
Thanks, Jane. You mentioned the plastic and petrochemical build out, which is another piece of what CIEL was an early entity in highlighting for the movement, which was that, what is the number now? You'll correct me, Stephen, as I point at you to go next, but it's some $200 billion in planned investments into expanded or new petrochemical and plastics production facilities. I mean, huge amounts of money that will lock in this infrastructure for decades to come, that'll continue to just push single-use plastics onto the market, where, as our studies have shown, it's supply and not demand that's pushing this. So Stephen, over to you. Tell us what you've been working on.
Sure, thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. As you heard, I'm Stephen Feit, Senior Attorney on the Climate and Energy team here at CIEL. And so I got into the plastics and pet chem work from the exact other side as Jane. I started working on climate and on fossil fuels, and it quickly became clear the fundamental role that plastics and petrochemicals play in this whole industry and sector and supply chain. So as you heard, we had the Fueling Plastic series in 2016 and the Plastic and Climate Report, which I was heavily involved in 2019. And now what's really exciting is we're seeing a lot of what we've been talking about for years moving into some of the central conversations in some pretty major political chambers. So one of the things I'm working on in the United States is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which is a federal bill which was introduced last year and was reintroduced in this Congress, which would do a whole host of things, including put fees on certain plastic products and ban some of the more difficult to deal with ones, and create a scheme of extended producer responsibility, which basically means that producers of plastic packaging and products would have to pay for the cost to collect and manage those products, as well as critically put a pause on new petrochemical production facilities. So these are the giant, mega facilities, the ethane crackers and the polymerization plants that spew all sorts of atrocious chemicals in addition to significant climate pollution. It would put a pause on those until the EPA had the opportunity to promulgate new regulations about how those facilities would have to operate. So that is one of the major pieces that I'm working on at present. Across the Atlantic, there's a bunch happening in the EU. Particularly, the process there is a bit different, but they're working on a methane regulation, which would basically deal with methane emissions in the energy, agriculture, and waste sectors. And because, as I'm sure we'll talk about, of the increasing connection between US fracking and European plastic production, we are working on an adaptation of our Plastic and Climate Report to that European context and highlighting the flows of petrochemical feedstocks from the United States to Europe to point out the ways in which what we're doing here needs to be grappled with what they're doing there. And that their regulations need to account for the fact that they can't just clean up what's happening within their borders and essentially export or import the emissions to the Permian Basin or Appalachia. And that's part of the broader European, it's called the Fit for 55. It's part of the European Green Deal, which is their big push to deal with climate. And so those are two of the major things I'm working on.
Thanks so much, Stephen. You mentioned the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act's pause on production plants, and I'm wondering, Yvette, you based in Houston, can you tell us a little bit about, how does that relate to the work that you're seeing, that you're a part of, and what else do you have that you want to put on the table for discussion here today?
So thank you so much, Amanda, Stephen, and Jane. I think you set a wonderful foundation for me to expand on that. So Fenceline Watch, my org, is really dedicated to stopping the multi-generational impacts, because we know that once toxics cross the fence line and affect people, the effects on them and their bodies will follow them for generations to come. So it's just not them here now or us here now, but us here tomorrow and with our children and grandchildren. So, I got into even talking about plastics in this very roundabout way. And it started off with completely rejecting the notion that I would ever work on plastics, right? Because plastics in my lens was the recycling conversations, the straw bans and the bag bans, and not necessarily petrochemicals. And so for the years prior to even joining Break Free from Plastic, I was very much concerned about the toxics crossing the fence line, not knowing what those toxics were actually producing, why they were being emitted into my community and the communities next to mine, and just saying, I don't understand why we have to be exposed to this, to then having this broader view through the Fueling Plastic series, like connecting petrochemicals, refining and extraction and storage to the actual plastics problem. So it was through that I started seeing those interconnections with the access to fracking over in West Texas, the Permian Basin, all the way to Manville, Texas. That's literally about an hour away from Houston, to the build out in infrastructure that we were experiencing post Hurricane Harvey, all the way from East Houston, where I am, to Galveston, making up the largest petrochemical complex and growing because of plastics. So, while I was trying to affect, the exposure part, the permitting part, I started learning how all of that was more interconnected. And if we went ahead and joined the conversation, we'd be able to learn a lot more. And so before Break Free from Plastics and conversations with great organizations like CIEL, I had no idea there was even a relation or a connection to this. And I started seeing an entrance way into speaking about the impacts on our communities on the front line and fence line, to the oceans conversations, to the waste conversations in Indonesia and Thailand, and then bringing it back home so that, folks understood that even in our communities, in what folks consider, a first world nation, we were having issues at the front line and fence line, simply with, access into the public input process. Folks in my community, including, my family, who we're first generation here, learning English for the very first time. We didn't have access to the information over, what is the facility next to us storing in these massive tanks, or, how do I get more information? So our point was being just cut off even at those meetings. We couldn't speak against them because we didn't know what these massive infrastructure projects even had, or what the impacts to our communities were, or the fact that, it was for trade. We were exporting the bulk amount of what was being produced and harming us here to another country that was even, more deprived of information, more deprived of rights. So there was definitely a lot of solidarity with folks in frontline fence line communities in other countries because of plastics, because of the plastics petrochem connection, our issues with language access, the daily issues with fugitive emissions, and even, chemical responses, because we go through chemical disasters on a more frequent basis than what people assume. So what people assume, and I honestly have never asked someone who doesn't live at the fence line, how often do you think a chemical disaster or an explosion at a plant occurs? From my experience just being here, it occurs multiple times a year, and we're exposed to fugitive emissions on a nightly basis. Flaring is consistent, and laws and regulations simply haven't caught up. So having great partners in places like CIEL or the Break Free from Plastics movement to help uplift those issues, whether it's language access, stopping the illegal toxic exposure, or the violation of our human rights, has been so crucial to my work too, and has helped me feel like I'm not alone in this, that there are partners on a much higher level that can also help and intertwine our issues.
Thanks so much, Yvette. As a reminder, the Q&A function is open if you would like to send your questions through. To kick us off, I would love, so much of what we hear, particularly in commercials, particularly in those sponsored by industry, is that it's a consumer problem, right? I was taught recycle, reduce, reuse, those magical 3 arrows. And I would love to hear, why, if this is not a consumer issue, which I believe, Yvette, you've begun to speak to here, what is it? Where are the push points? How do we move this industry in a direction that protects human lives and protects the environment for generations to come?
And one of the resources that Stephen pointed out with the American Chemistry, Consortium, or the American Chemistry Council, put out this wonderful infographic for us to really distill, and it showed their priorities, right? And their priorities are access to fossil fuels, really impacting state regulations, affecting infrastructure, permitting, and then trade. So I see those as also pinch points we can get to. So if we start tackling everything from the export, right, of fossil fuels, LNG, that is largely used for plastics production, then we can make sure that at least there's a cutoff, right, to even the raw material that would be needed. My first campaign was HR 702, where we rallied 28 different organizations in the Gulf Coast because they were exporting crude oil and crude oil products. That's insane. We hadn't done that before, but getting at those export terminals in the places where they're affecting, like the Gulf Coast, is so imperative to us, something we don't quite think of, because when you talk to an everyday person, they're like, the oil and the gas that is being extracted is being used to fuel my home for heating, my car for driving, and it's not, it's for single use. The permitting process, if we could all get together, and just like in the Break Free from Plastics pollution piece, there was attention brought to language barriers in communities affected. It's not just Spanish-speaking communities. We have Vietnamese communities along the coast. We have Ethiopian communities. We have communities that have a culture of being along the waters, and their culture is with fishermen, fisher folk like, Diane Wilson, even in Port Lavaca, where if we had access into permitting, we could affect those processes. And that's simply saying, you as a person have the right to impact the community you live in, right? To protect your family, your future, and those around you. Infrastructure, probably in my case, the biggest piece. I live down the road from our massive petrochemical complex, and across the street from massive above ground storage facilities that have little to no regulation. So stopping those infrastructure projects through things like the public input process, because individual people have so much power, but if we're not given access to where that meeting is, a proper time, I doubt folks know, but a permit challenge, you have to be available Monday through Friday between 10 a.m. to roughly 3 p.m. So folks like my neighbors and my parents who work double shifts can't attend these. And we've asked the permitting process to be mindful of, can you please do, an early morning one for like students, and an evening one or a couple on the weekends for working folks and folks who have to basically pull 2 job shifts, because it's unfair. And it's known, the EPA does very similar things, and we've asked them to change. So for me, it would be those 2, and obviously access. So I'll turn it over to Jane and Stephen to add anything else.
In addition to my superiors at CIEL, I have the delight of having a boss who is 4.5 years old and is very dedicated to certain kinds of snacks, and cheese in particular is his favorite these days. I can't get those snacks not in plastic. And even where there are options, one of his favorites is peanut butter. Our household goes through so much peanut butter. To buy the peanut butter that's in the glass jar as opposed to the plastic jar, I have to pay nearly twice as much. To get the stuff that's not loaded with sugar, I have to pay another premium on top of that. Until we unpack the fact that avoiding plastics as a consumer is extremely expensive and inaccessible. There are whole grocery stores that don't even sell peanut butter in anything other than a plastic jar. Until we overcome that issue, this will never be a consumer problem. Until we figure out the interconnectedness between the global food supply, the global water supply, and the local water supply, until we literally unwrap that from plastics, we will keep being in a place where people are told you have to be the solution to this, and yet there is no way to get out from underneath it. I've been working on this for 10 years. In all of that time, I've worked under the salary of nonprofits, and I have never been able to actually get out of plastics in my house. First of all, there's like plastics all over my desk. My computer is made of plastic. My pens are made of plastic. There's plastic everywhere. But even when I bought the stainless steel pens, that pen was like the price of 2 boxes of the plastic pens. And also it's too small for my hand, which is like a whole other problem. But in the last 10 years, I have never been able to effectively feed my family. I've never been able to actually even have like every single thing that we need for our house. There is not a plastic-free alternative. And, I read the blogs and I try to follow the online recipes and I try to do all the things that come out of that. And I make almost all of the food that we eat here. We very rarely eat takeout, which for me as a woman or as a feminine leaning person, however that gets characterized in households, that is an extreme extra burden on me. And I love my partner. He is one of the best people in the whole world. And that is still a massive additional burden for me as the person who does the cooking and the laundry and things like that, and most of our shopping. And I think that that's also something we can't get around. Whether we like it or not, women are going to carry a larger burden around the solving the plastics crisis, and just the people who end up doing the homemaking, however that shakes out. It is not an equal distribution of burden and time, which in that regard, I also can't think of it as a consumer issue. And I think hopefully as a segue over to Stephen, these are global supply chains that we're looking at here, not just for our food and increasingly, unfortunately, not just for our water, but for the plastics themselves. The companies that we are fighting that are building out in South Louisiana, Shell is not a US company. Formosa Plastics is not a US company. Shintech, Wanhua, Huayang, I think I'm saying that correctly, methanol, these are not US companies, which means these are companies that are building all over the world, not just in the United States, and US companies are building all over the world. Exxon has facilities all over the place. And because the supply chain is global, the customers are global, they're building resin, they're creating resins in one place and then shipping them somewhere else. And then the waste that gets created from those plastics resins is then itself shipped somewhere else, to the point where we've had to have whole new international treaties about the international shipment of plastic waste. Because the nature of this supply chain is global, the solutions to the problem have to also be global. They are both hyper-local in the communities that live alongside both petrochemical facilities, but also recycling facilities, also landfills. And they are hyper-local when it comes to literally the peanut butter that is on the shelf in my pantry. Well, the bookcase that serves as a pantry in my kitchen. And they are very, very global. And therefore, we have to figure out solutions that actually meet the balance of both global organizing and local organizing, and global community support and local community support. And with that, I'll pass it to Stephen.
Thanks, Jane. I feel like every synapse in my brain is firing and I want to keep track of all the things. But just maybe in reverse order, it's really important to stress, right, that the reason the plastic is so cheap is not because it has to be or because that's like how the world has to work, but plastics are artificially cheap because of both the combination of positive affirmative subsidies for the fossil fuel industry and the petrochemical industry in all sorts of forms that we can talk about, and the negative subsidy in terms of allowing all of these externalities to accrue with no accounting for them, whether that's toxics, whether that's the climate pollution, whether that's the clogging of waterways and the destruction of natural ecosystems. There was last week during Earth Week, I think it was actually on Earth Day, there was a hearing, right, about fossil fuel subsidies. And just like as one example, right, oil and gas producers can do, this is so technical, but it's basically, they can depreciate everything up front rather than doing it over time, which is a complicated way of saying they basically get 0% interest loans from the federal government when they operate. The intangible drilling costs they get to deduct right away, which other companies don't get to do. In terms of the petrochemical facilities themselves, and Jane, I know you've done a lot of work on this, they get enormous tax incentives, abatements, huge grants of, it could be for a $9 billion facility, $1.2 billion in tax awards. So we are talking about a substance that is cheap, not because it is cheap, but it's cheap because of the system that produces it and the system and the policies that are in place to support it. Not to mention the fact that for the bulk of the history of plastic production, plastic has been subsidized by oil and gas drilling, by the conglomerates, the multinational oil majors, who then are trying to monetize what's essentially a waste stream. So none of this is fundamental and none of it is absolute. And I also I want to highlight that this also isn't by accident. We talked about this in our third of 4 Fueling Plastic series, that the switch in the United States from returnable, multi-use refillable bottles to single-use bottles and cans was a deliberate choice, not by consumers who are like, we want to throw stuff out, but by the industry that realized for every one refillable, returnable bottle, you could sell 20 single-use ones and just make more money that way. And similarly, Yvette, like you were saying, people know when people are at work. It's not a mistake that the hearings are from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday. And I think there is a huge part of this whole story that is this kind of ingrained myth that either this is the way it has to be, or this is the way that it just happened while no one was paying attention. And neither of those are true.
Can I also add one thing onto what Stephen just said? When the single use first came on the market, these companies had to teach people how to throw away. They had to run ad campaigns in Life magazine in the US. And I assume they did this and are still doing this in other countries. They had to tell people how to throw things away because we didn't know. And in many ways, the plastics are being subsidized on the front end by oil and gas, and they're being subsidized by us because I pay $24 on every water bill every month for a sanitation fee. And that sanitation fee pays for trash pickup and recycling. Yes, they'd have to pick up my trash regardless, but I promise you there would not be nearly as much trash to pick up if there wasn't so much plastic. And my house is not producing as much plastic as other houses. And I think it's incredibly important for us to reflect on the fact that we are also subsidizing the plastics industry by paying their waste costs on every single water bill or however your local city actually collects your sanitation fee.
And the corporate welfare continues whenever a disaster hits. You know, it doesn't matter how much money, whether in property or hospital bills, communities and individual people get affected by. There's a cap in our state of Texas over how much a facility can get fined, including plastics facility, and that's $250,000 a day. It doesn't matter how much cancer-causing benzene is dumped into our air. So even after folks are taken to court for these massive chemical disasters, they get discounts. There's facility discounts, a discount for turning in your paperwork early, for voluntarily filing, any, you know, fugitive emissions, literally for saying, I dumped benzene or I dumped 1,3-butadiene that's going to cause your children developmental effects. I dumped this into the air. They get a discount for reporting that early. So the amount of discounts actually makes it feasible and creates that super cheap plastic, because all of these costs are externalized, and what's externalized doesn't ever come back to us. We don't necessarily get cumulative research on the impacts of, you know, over 90 facilities along the Houston Ship Channel dumping daily toxics into our communities. So we don't have the information. We don't know how to evacuate or where to evacuate to, because, you know, then oil and gas and the chemical facilities lobby in DC, and then they get anti-terrorism, you know, basic policies or legislation out that instead of keeping us safe, they actually keep us in harm's way, because we don't even have access to what's being manufactured at a facility. So right to know, it's not necessarily our right to know, because in their eyes, it's an anti-terrorism tactic.
Well, that's a lot of broken systems. Thinking then about, if it's not about consumer choice, what are ways for people to plug in and get involved? And we also, well, I'll pause there, and maybe, I don't know who might want to go first.
Can I go first?
Sure.
I think there's actually so much people can do. Stephen's already mentioned the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I think one of the simplest things that folks can do right now is to email their representatives and senators to say that you support this act and say that you support regulation of these companies. If you are in a state where plastics are being produced, even if there's no bill before your legislature, email your representatives and say, like, I don't want this here and it's hurting people and we shouldn't do this. I'm your constituent. You should listen to me. I love telling people to email their senators. But I also think it's important to talk about this issue in its entirety. Like, yes, do what you can inside your own house, bring your own bottle, and go to a meeting, organize with people, talk to your neighbors about it. You know, if you're going to participate in a cleanup, which I imagine that, you know, CIEL supporters probably have a disproportionate number of people who do things like participate in environmental cleanups, which thanks, CIEL, you're the best. If you're going to do that, have some education on the back end, have some way to count the brands that you see in the stuff that you've cleaned up, to write them a letter and tell them, hey, I've cleaned up a lot of your garbage here and I think you should package differently. And just also at the hyper local level, if your city or town doesn't have a zero waste plan, there's lots of things that you can do to be part of that. You can like request and encourage that local retailers actually go zero waste. One of the simple things we've done locally is anytime a restaurant takes on, like, they try to have less plastic or they try to have less single use generally, we literally like list their name on a website and we just say, like, go to Cafe Borrega because they don't have straws, or, you know, go to Parkway because all their stuff is packaged in paper. And that actually incentivizes not just those restaurants to stay at it in the face of what might be more expensive practices, but also encourages other restaurants to actually, like, they're like, well, I want to be on the website. And so it actually creates a peer pressure situation. And we talk to folks and we hold meetings, and meetings are fun. I got asked recently on Twitter, and then I'll pass it on. Tell me you're an organizer without telling me you're an organizer. And my response to that was, I like to go to meetings after all my meetings are done. And I feel like that's something that I strongly encourage folks to do is, be part of acting as a.
Yeah, I would say to that is, if people want to get involved, one, it's, keep on doing what you're doing and support organizations like CIEL. I would say join the Break Free from Plastics movement. There's so many conversations, so many discussions, everything from podcasts to, movies, conversations that are just generated. And sometimes that can be the most helpful thing because you get to learn from other people who are affected in different ways. There were a couple of webinars, that happened last month where it was intersecting the issue. So I struggle with reproductive health problems, and there was a reproductive specialist who was holding a webinar tying that to plastics. And so I was able to learn just such a massive amount of information. So understanding that the plastics problem is intersectional through and throughout, how it affects our bodies, our ecosystem, and how they're all intertwined together is probably one of the first and best steps you can do, because the more you hear these conversations, the more you learn about, I consume a credit card's worth of plastic. How often? That's crazy. I would say, yes, go to your local grocery stores and suggest, grocery stores have to take suggestions from people who are buying on stocking alternative products so that people have a choice. And I would say, don't just do that there. Go into food deserts and, go into those grocery stores and advocate to have those alternative products, because plastic is so much more, it is so predatory on vulnerable communities. Not only are we having to absorb the chemical impacts at, as we walk outside or go to the grocery store or walk to the park, but also at the grocery store, everything from our cereals, our grains, our juices are packed in plastic, and so much heavier and so much more toxic plastic. If you do go out and you are ordering in a lot, go onto your Yelp and say, hey, look, I really didn't appreciate so-and-so had this kind of packaging. Let's move over to X kind of cardboard, paper, wax paper, whatever it is, and keep the conversation going. And I would say your one extra step is get involved with communities that are in need right now, because a community in need right now tends to sit in the shadow of an industry that is hurtful to the community and to us in general. So like, Stephen and Jane said, plastics is a waste issue. So communities next to landfills, it is a production issue. Communities next to refineries, storage tanks, port communities, the fracking, and even pipelines. So find out where this infrastructure is. I think we all have a little bit of homework to do, but that little bit of homework opens our eyes in a way we've never thought so before. So yeah, that's what I would say. Get a little more involved, follow environmental justice conversations so that you hear different aspects of these things, and support them, support reshoot out. Twitter is powerful. We've seen that, unfortunately, through the last administration. So they'll continue to be echoes of advocacy in those social medias.
Thanks, Yvette. We are getting close to our time, and I want to make sure that we get in one last question. So Stephen, if you have pressing things you want to add, you can lump it into your response. But I would love to hear, what is one success for the movement or within the movement that each of you have seen or experienced recently, that you draw inspiration from? We'll start with, I was going to start with Stephen, but you did a big inhale. So no, we're going to start with Stephen. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's it's a great question, and I want to also try to think about something I was involved in, so I'm not just taking credit for other people's work. This is actually, okay, this is a really technical and really specific answer, and it's about legislation, and it's maybe kind of boring and in the weeds, but there was a bill last Congress called the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act that had a particular, there were issues throughout it, but it had a particular section supporting chemical recycling, which is a fancy name for burning plastic either to make fuel or just to burn it, or occasionally it turns back into plastic, but usually not really. And it's this dirty process. It has huge toxic emissions. It has huge greenhouse gas emissions. And this bill was going to support it. And very quickly, once a few organizations, us and a few key other partners, pointed out this language and how problematic it was that the support was going to be in this bill, we mobilized a huge number of organizations, including ones that ostensibly don't work on chemical recycling or petrochemicals, ones that are ostensibly, plastic waste organizations that you wouldn't think of as necessarily being in this space. But I think it was a real, and so that language got stripped out of the bill. And it was a success. And so I think that is both like a victory on its own merits, but also really demonstrative of how connected these movements are becoming, that this is not a group of siloed activists or a group of folks working on this issue over here and that issue over there, but really the entire chain is being dealt with all at once. And it's only getting more powerful by the day.
Something that we just had a great win was in the state of Texas. We were in that final stage and stretch, and we finally got translation and interpretation services at our public meetings for all folks and all different abilities. So that was extremely, talk about being a part of history and being able to get civil rights for our communities. I felt very empowered, and just, it gives me that extra gas to keep going with this, because when you're dealing with oil, gas, and petrochemicals, you feel so many losses that it's hard to sort of make a little light in the tunnel. So I'll pass it to Jane.
That is so real. There's a lot of losses. So on that, I'm actually going to celebrate two things that I'm excited about. One is very local and one is very global. So when we first started working on the idea for a plastics treaty 2 years ago, it was a very uphill battle. Actually, I guess 3 years ago at this point, very uphill. And we were like, it's going to take years. Even care about saying, I don't know how quickly this is going to come up. Y'all, it came up really quickly. And there were a couple of early champions, but a lot of states were neutral. A lot of countries were neutral or didn't feel like this was worth the time, or some directly oppositional. We have never seen so many countries change a position so quickly, at least I haven't, on an issue like this. We now have over 140 countries. That is way more than half the world saying we need a new treaty on plastics. And most of those supporting what is legally binding, something that has teeth, that will require a change in the way we are using and making plastics. And that is huge. We're not there yet. It's not a done deal. We still have to actually get them to agree to create the mandate to negotiate that treaty. But at least they've said on the record that they will. And that is really, really exciting. And these are countries from every region. These are countries who touch the point of the plastic supply chain. This is a big deal. The US is not one of those countries yet, but fingers crossed we'll actually get there. And we'll see how that's shifting over the next months. And then the other win I have is very, very local. So I mentioned a minute ago that we've been fighting the Formosa plastics plant here, which is this mega complex. It's 14 plants all rolled into one air permit, which is shocking. And it's on 2,400 acres in along the Mississippi River. And we've been fighting the local parish where it's going to be built, because in Louisiana we have parishes and not counties. And so we've been fighting the local government, and they don't listen to us, and it's been an uphill battle, and they still gave the thing its permit. We're fighting the federal government, and they don't want to listen to us. Well, they're kind of listening to us because the permit's suspended right now, but they're probably going to reissue it. So we started actually shifting our attention, like, how can we get some elected officials to say that this facility is not good? So we started the communities downriver, and we started organizing in the cities that draw their drinking water from the river where the Formosa facility is going to be. And in the last 3 weeks, 2 cities, including New Orleans, have had unanimous votes against the construction of the Formosa plastics plant. And we now have a plan to get lots of other cities downriver from the plant to say, we don't want this, because it doesn't have legal power or restriction. It doesn't have teeth, but it is a huge win in the conversation and the public permission, if you will, to have these facilities. And it's a huge win in the understanding of people in Louisiana about what these facilities are doing to us. And the second city New Orleans is fairly progressive, but the second city that passed it is actually not. It's mostly conservative. And so it was really surprising to us that they did it of their own volition. We didn't even organize them. And so we are looking forward to actually accomplishing these around the state of Louisiana and really actually shifting the tide on whether or not Louisiana just keeps accepting more petrochemical development. So fingers crossed, we'll see where that goes. I also just want to tie that thread together that we have a Vietnamese member of the New Orleans City Council, and she was actually instrumental in getting this passed. To go back to what Yvette was saying earlier, that the communities across South Louisiana are actually really diverse, and it takes a village for us to stop this. It takes a state, a country, a world. It's very exciting.
My heart is full, y'all. Thank you for sharing those stories and those successes. It definitely takes a world. We are about at time, so I'm going to kick it back to Taylor to finish us up for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you to our panelists for that fascinating and provoking conversation. Before y'all go, we would love your feedback on a few things. Broadly, if you have feedback on how we can improve this series going forward, you can fill out our anonymous survey that will be available at the end of the webinar. And more specifically, we are hoping to rebrand this series with a new name, and we would love your input on this process as well. So we're going to share a quick poll with a few name suggestions. There we go. And we'd love it if y'all could just vote for the name you like the most. So if y'all could go ahead and vote for your favorite name. Also feel free to share any other name suggestions in the chat. If you have any other ideas, we'd love to hear them. So I'm going to give y'all 10 more seconds to vote, maybe 20, and then we'll reveal the winner. All right, it looks like most of y'all have voted, so I'm going to end it. All right, so it looks like Ask Our Experts was the winner. Don't know if y'all can see that, but yeah, Ask Our Experts, followed by Environment Exchange. So thank you. Excellent. We'll keep those in mind, and we'll also consider any suggestions that y'all have in the chat or in our feedback survey. And we should have a new name in time for our next fireside chat. And for those who are interested, our next chat will be over the summer. We're ironing out the details, but it will broadly cover human rights and sustainable development. So stay tuned for that. And once again, thank you for attending our chat today and for asking great questions. Also, thank you to our panelists who are truly doing amazing work and who took time out of their very busy schedules to tell us about that work. And finally, thank you to those working behind the scenes, Kat and Lonnie. We couldn't do this without y'all. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your week.